Hello and welcome to OnGeopolitics, this podcast from the Centre for Geopolitics at the University of Cambridge. Our unique selling point is that we look at geopolitical issues in a historical context. My name's Suzanne and Ali, and I am joined by my regular co-host, Professor Ali Ansari. But the news is, as you no doubt will have noticed, that neither Ali or I have had the time necessary to produce a regular output of these podcasts. So we have resolved in a, I think, really good way to hand this over to two of our great colleagues at the Centre for Geopolitics, Professor Bill Hurst, who's the co-director, and Dr. John Nilsson-Wright. And between them, we'll introduce them a bit more in a minute, they are going to take over from Ali and I. And we're not going away completely, are we, Ali?
Not at all, not at all. We will hopefully be back for guest appearances if our two succeeding co-hosts will have us, of course. But I like to think that we will be back on a regular basis. It's just that, as you said, things, well, certainly for me, are getting quite busy at the moment. And I think the ability to do a regular podcast, which is really something that we need to do, has been quite difficult for me. And I know, you're going on to very interesting things from August, I think, Suzanne. So there will be other pressures on your time too.
That's right, but it's not about us, Ali. So
no.
I should say, in case everyone thinks this is just introspection, we're about to have what I hope will be a completely fascinating conversation about the state of the world this summer. But I'd like to hand over to John and Bill so that they can introduce themselves a bit more now.
Okay, so first of all, this is John Nilsson-Wright. As Suzanne said, I'm also based at the Centre for Geopolitics, where I focus on Korea and Japan. I'm excited at the prospect of stepping into these two enormous pairs of shoes. It's going to be a tough act to follow, but Bill and I are thinking of what we might do to take the podcast forward. We want to preserve the integrity of the brand, as they say, and at the same time offer our own perspective on different issues. So one of the things I'll be doing is hopefully chatting on a fairly regular basis, looking at current developments. So essentially trying to do very much what Suzanne and Ali have been doing. Bill, over to you.
Thank you, John. And I understand your section will be called On Geopolitics Currents.
That's right.
And my section will be called On Geopolitics Explorations. And it will take a slightly different tack to explore individual themes, issues, or concepts in a broader and more in-depth way over a period of time. And so it will be less about current events, more about sort of big ideas, big structures, and long-term trends. And there'll be episodes of that kind of coming out on a fixed schedule, the first set of which will happen in the autumn and will be about the theme of war, the idea of war in geopolitics, war in international relations, both conceptually and concretely in different contexts.
So we're hoping, dear listeners, that John and Bill will be an enhancement of the regular service you've been having up to now from Ali and I. And Bill, on the theme of war, and John on the theme of current affairs, there's a lot of both at the moment. And I think we're always very conscious on this podcast that it's very difficult for us to provide. We're not a running commentary podcast at all, but what we can do is step back at moments of intense activity and say, well, what's really going on and what should we be looking for? And so having the three of you here now, given what we've just had in terms of that sort of intensity of, I think, Ali, the intensity of the Israel-US Iranian activity has only been matched by the intensity of your public media appearances over the last month to discuss this issue.
Is activity a euphemism of some sort?
Yes.
Is that what you mean? Activity. I think, yes, the hot war that has emerged from, started on Friday the 13th, an inauspicious date, it has to be said, but yes, the hot war that emerged was not entirely, I have to say, unsurprising to those of us who watched this quite closely. It was always on the cards. I think probably the timing took a number of us by surprise. But it seemed to me that once Trump had said there was a 60-day sort of window for negotiations, and after that, all hell will break loose, to paraphrase it, that something would have had to happen if his credibility was not to be completely blown away. And the Iranians clearly were seeking to push that. I mean, they had assumed that he was bluffing, and they wanted to call his bluff, a little bit like, what happened between in the negotiations from the JCPOA. There was a lot of arguments then that there was a serious Israeli threat, and they wanted to sort of accelerate the negotiations in order to anticipate that. And of course, there never was really. I mean, at the time, for one reason or another, the Obama administration was able to contain any impulses on the Israelis. So the Iranians were able to prolong those negotiations over a period of 2 years, which to my mind was actually quite counterproductive for them, because during that time, Obama lost control of Congress and so on and so forth. But in this case, it seemed to be that things were a little bit more unstable as far as that was concerned. So I think it's not the first time, nor I suspect the last time, that the Iranian leadership miscalculated.
It's an interesting question, that this tactic, which is not only used by the Iranians, of prolonging negotiations, as though that's going to be in somehow a sort of holding position that you can hold for a long time to enable you to keep doing what you're doing. And I presume that in this case, what America and Israel have done, and what in many other instances other states are starting to do, is to say, they're prolonging negotiations, I'm going to do something. And I'm going to give myself the advantage by taking action while they think that the really good tactic is just to prolong the discussion.
See, I've always felt that the Iranian approach to these sort of things is what I call a sort of a verbal scorched earth policy. So that they want to wear you down, and they want to wear you down by basically a sort of a verbal attrition. And it is exhausting. I mean, anyone who's negotiated in any of these cases, they find it extremely exhausting. And eventually you do end up making concessions that you otherwise would not have. I mean, even if you look at the JCPOA, when the Americans started that negotiation, they were talking really that Iran would have no more than 500 centrifuges. They're very clear on it. And they told the Israelis and the Saudis and others that's all they'll get. By the end of it, they had upwards of at least 5,000, I think probably 8,000. And, of course, a lot of the regional allies were very shocked at this, essentially, because it gave the Iranians a sort of an enrichment capacity that could then, once the sunset clauses came in, be effectively unleashed, which is what the Iranians were bragging about. But it's an approach to negotiation which basically works on the premise that I have time, you don't, we can sit it out, and you'll eventually, the environment, in a sense, will eventually change in our favor. And I think they would have looked at the Trump administration and thought, it's pretty volatile. Who knows what will happen domestically? His domestic situation may weaken, and then we'll be able to play a much better hand. And in this case, obviously, as I said, they miscalculated that particular approach.
I'm taking the role of compare here. I want to bring in Bill Hurst. Bill, you've just published an article in Foreign Affairs with Peter Trubowitz, who's Professor of International Relations at LSE. And I noticed that your first sentence was, hope springs eternal in the world of great power diplomacy. But then you go on to explain why it shouldn't. Talk about how it looks from your perspective at the moment.
With regard to Iran or with regard to the US-China situation?
Well, with regards, I suppose they're not unconnected, are they?
I think the connection is tangential. Yeah. And I would say, on Ali's point, some of the tactic of delay or of prolonging negotiations, whether in Iran or somewhere else, can often just come down to one side believing, usually not without merit, that ultimately I care more about this than you do. And, eventually your attention will be distracted elsewhere, or you will decide that something else matters more, and then I can get a bit more of what I want. And so I think that's an easy calculation to make. You don't even have to worry about U.S. domestic politics or exactly how strong Obama or Trump is vis-a-vis the Congress. You can just wait and assume that the U.S. eventually will find other things more important or just be distracted somewhere else. In terms of the US-China argument that we were trying to make in that article, what essentially we're arguing is that there are domestic political factors as well as kind of structural international factors that limit or push the US-China relationship in particular directions. And basically that only when there's a common enemy faced by both countries internationally will they cooperate meaningfully on security. And only when both countries are governed by ruling coalitions that are supportive of globalization or free trade will they cooperate meaningfully on trade or economic relations. And so right now, unfortunately, what we see is that neither the US nor China is governed by a ruling coalition that's committed in any meaningful way to globalization or free trade. And neither that nor do they face any common enemy on the global stage that can be identified, not in the way that they did during, say, the 1970s and 80s, where the Soviet Union was clearly the common enemy, nor in the way that they did indeed during the Second World War, where Japan was the common enemy. There were some attempts after the demise of the Soviet Union to identify non-traditional security threats as common enemies, such as terrorism writ large, or climate change, or even actually infectious disease during the Obama years was one. All of those fizzled, most spectacularly perhaps during COVID with infectious disease. But before that, when it came to climate change, where both were basically blaming one another for the problem and not accepting the solutions or lack of solutions offered by either. And with terrorism, it was about who the terrorists were, right? There were lots of groups that China identified as terrorists who the US did not see as terrorists, and vice versa, right? So our Uyghur separatist terrorists are the Taliban terrorists. Different perspectives from those two countries meant that it was very hard, therefore, to see a common threat. And I would even just say non-traditional security threats are difficult to define as common enemies. State actors are much more straightforward in that regard. So in today's world, without that common enemy, without that coincidence of governing coalitions in both countries being committed to free trade, it's unlikely that we'll see meaningful cooperation on either trade or security. And in fact, the best we could really hope for is small steps, small incremental steps towards reducing the risk of inadvertent war or escalation, most notably in the South China Sea, small steps towards greater transparency in areas of trade like finance, and small steps maybe in harmonizing protocols or regulations around things like cybercrime, environmental regulation and protection, etc. Any talk of a grand bargain, I think, is foolish. And in fact, what the United States would have to give up in security terms to win something in economic terms in any sort of grand bargain scenario that we could picture, it would be too great. And it just wouldn't make sense at all for the United States, and vice versa for China.
So if I can just jump in here, picking up on something that Bill said, I mean, this idea of small steps, but also I thought Ali's very interesting characterization of a verbal scorched earth policy, this time from the perspective of America and its allies. We see the United States locked into a really difficult set of trade negotiations with Japan, as well as, of course, with other countries. And I'm struck by how some of the norms that we used to see as part of the international order of close cooperation between like-minded partners are being fundamentally challenged. We've had 7 rounds of unsuccessful tariff negotiations between Tokyo and Washington. And Donald Trump seems to be operating in a world in which, Bill mentioned the adversarial relationship with China over trade and a variety of other issues, but it's striking now how much Donald Trump sees contemporary Japan through the lens of the 1980s. And yet, at a time when domestic politics is making it very difficult for the leadership of Prime Minister Ishiba to find a way through to actually reach a deal to provide something that is going to satisfy this much more transactional approach on the part of the US government. And I think that's important. Again, and this comes back to your point at the beginning, Suzanne. We like to think that our historical perspective is really important in understanding what's happening at present. I'm really struck at how the historical underpinnings of America's relationship with its key partners in Asia are now being pretty fundamentally thrown into question. Not very loudly on the part of government officials, but privately, whether you're sitting in Tokyo or you're in Seoul, the assumptions that America has our back are now being really looked at very, very hard. And I think that really opens up an interesting question of what will this mean in terms of wider alliance cooperation. The obvious push from the United States, both in Europe and in Asia, to encourage allies to take on a bigger share of the defense burden is getting traction. And we saw that at the NATO summit. It's getting some traction, I think, by necessity in Seoul and Tokyo. But that also creates an opportunity for these countries to start thinking about how they begin to chart their own destiny. It's not decoupling, but there's certainly an element of de-risking that I think is influencing the thinking of these once steadfast allies who now have to think quite strategically about how they minimize their exposure to a United States that seems increasingly, maybe unreliable is too strong a term, but certainly more unpredictable. And I don't think this is just the madman strategy that we saw during the Nixon era. This suggests to me that there is a more fundamental recalibration. And that is a creative opportunity for countries like Japan and South Korea and countries in Europe to think about how they work together. But the challenge for them is, how do they do this without overtly undermining or weakening their traditional relationship on the United States? And I think that's going to be a really interesting question to explore over the next weeks and months.
It is a creative opportunity for America's allies to rethink how they do things differently. But it is, of course, also an extraordinary creative opportunity for America's adversaries. And I suppose this question is to Ali and Bill, because I don't think, you can tell me I'm wrong. I'm very happy to be told I'm wrong. I'm not sure whether certainly Iran and to some extent China are yet making the most of the creative opportunities that are opening up to them as countries are realizing that America is not going to be there for them anymore. And you might say, Ali, that Iran doesn't have any creative opportunities. I mean, it's under so much pressure that the creative opportunities it would instinctively turn to, which are essentially to use a number of different instruments at their disposal, geographically dispersed around the world, to create disruption and mayhem, are just, they know that all that's going to do is bring more punishment down on them, which is not going to help. So I can't see what creative opportunities they've got left. Whereas for China, there's all sorts of opportunities to change dynamics as nations think, well, I need to hedge a bit more than I have been doing. I don't know, Ali, whether you want to start first.
Well, I mean, I can probably be quite quick before handing over to Bill, because I think the opportunities for China are clearly greater. I mean, in the sense that Iran's strategy in the region has collapsed. I mean, basically it's collapsed, and it's been shown to be somewhat hollower than people thought. If you even look at the reaction of, say, Hezbollah and some of the other proxy militias, during this conflict, they've sort of said, we sympathize, but we're sort of standing aside. We're not going to get involved. And certainly in the Lebanese environment, there's a sense that we're not fighting Iran's war support rate, essentially. But I think there's something more fundamental here as far as Iran is concerned. And that is that in Iran at the moment, there is a genuine, I think, fight for the heart and soul, in the sense of the country and the revolution and whatever else and how it's going to proceed. And I think that fight is much more interesting than some people are suggesting, because even there are people who are insiders within the leadership who are arguing for a much, much more moderate position, as well as, hardliners who are saying, no, we have to push. And so there's a fight going on within the leadership. And then there's also a fight for the sort of public opinion, if I can put it that way. And I encountered this, really in the aftermath of the Iran-Iraq war as well, which is quite interesting, is that you find that people who have to pay the cost of the conflict I tend to be a lot more moderate about, what they want, because they know what the costs of making the wrong decision are. Whereas, and this is where the diaspora is actually in some ways much more polarized. There are those in the diaspora who are much softer, want to see better relations between, say, the West and Iran, so on and so forth. But there are also those in the diaspora who are much more hardline, because they don't have to pay the cost of what's going on. I mean, they sort of sit there and they're sort of really sort of chanting hardlines or nationalist sort of rhetoric. And, I would see this, in the aftermath of the Iran-Iraq war. You talk to an Iranian who lived the 8 years in Iran, and he's much more sanguine about, I don't think, war is not a good thing. Whereas the person who spent all his time outside Iran might say, oh, the might of Iran must be, we must push even further, so on and so forth. So I think that multi-level sort of like discussion, both in the leadership and in wider society, is going on. And it's the leadership one that we probably need to look at the moment. And of course, because they're looking inward, that's why I don't think, frankly, they've got any opportunity to sort of seize any sort of chances that they might see abroad.
Sorry, I just wanted to interrupt on that point, because I wanted to say something that you've been saying to me that you haven't just said, which is, I think, really important to understand as kind of Western observers of Iran, that there are people within the Iranian leadership structures who think that the reason that they have failed is not because the course was wrong, but that they haven't done it with enough commitment, with enough...
Pure enough. Yeah, they haven't been pure enough.
And so that kind of make Iran great again thing for me, it's really important to understand that exists, because otherwise,
it certainly does.
Otherwise, you see all the coverage, and it's always the thing: the people who talk are often the people who want change or who are open to talking. And so I worry that it's really hard to get a rounded impression of all the different arguments.
See, that's where I would disagree with you.
Oh, great. Okay.
Because I think it does exist, but I don't think it's hard to find. Okay. I mean, you just have to know where to look on social media.
Yeah, no, but you can find it, but we can't find it.
No, Radio 4 gives a platform to one of them anyway on quite a regular level, and that's Dr. Marandi, who sits at the University of Tehran. And if you look at his social media account, it's full of fire and brimstone. I mean, it's not a joke. And there are a number of others who have given voice to this. So it's there. I mean, I suppose where I do differ from you is that I don't think that we're not seeing this. I think some people choose not to see it. It's there. But I do think also that the balance of power, so to speak, in Iran is probably, it's more contested than any of us think. I mean, and I don't think that the hardliners are necessarily in the driving seat. I mean, Pezeshkian, the president, who, let's be honest, is a bit of a cipher. I'm not saying he's in a position of a tremendous amount of power. But nonetheless, for him to get up and give a comment in the middle of this conflict with Israel and say, I don't see why we can't all get on. And, the Israelis have their country. They have their country. He didn't say Israelis. He said they have their country. We have our country. Let's just stick to each other. Let's not bother each other. And, there would be people in Iran who'd say, well, it would have been handy if you could have said that 3 weeks ago. I mean, rather than now. Do you know? I mean, it's, why you say, but it's also a reflection of the fact that he basically doesn't really have any power. I mean, but he does say these things. And people do wonder, why are we in this life and death struggle with Israel, which, our leaders have said we're going to win. And actually, within 72 hours, we lost control of our airspace. I mean, you've got to sort of see from an Iranian perspective, even those who are proud of the regime and its revolution are sort of reeling from the fact that their foreign minister had to get permission from the Israelis to fly to the conference in Geneva for the negotiations with the E3. I mean, they did not have control of their own airspace. And so, you have to alert the Israelis, I'm about to fly out, by the way, please don't shoot the plane down. It's that absurd. And I think, even for those who are pro-regime have been slightly knocked sideways by this, because they've been led to believe that the country is very strong and can handle itself. And, some people did say to me, they said, we don't like the regime, but we did think it could defend us. And actually it can't even do that. So all I'd say is that the debate is very, very diverse, complex. And of course, the same individual can have two different opinions at the same time, and voice it. I mean, this is a fact. And I think we struggle sometimes to reconcile that. I think, you would be more aware than me that in these sort of very traumatic conflict situations, people have very, very contradictory views almost at the same time. So that's why I say to people, be careful about drawing conclusions from the vox pops as you go around and say, because people will change their minds. So when the dust settles, I'm quite sure there will be a reckoning. I'm quite sure. But it won't happen yet. And that's why separately, I know I'm dragging on a bit, this sort of idea of regime change and stuff was complete nonsense for them to introduce that. They should have left that alone. It was a real hostage to fortune. But Bill, I think the Chinese are probably in a much better position to take advantage of the chaos that we are seeing.
Well, I would use that really overused analogy of the side view mirror in a car that says objects in mirror are closer than they appear. In this context, I would say actually that China is less revisionist than it may appear. There's very little to be gained from pushing too hard to undermine existing rule structures and institutions. China tried that strategy from the 1950s through part of the 1970s, and it didn't really work very well. It was the obvious strategy for a revolutionary regime in the immediate post-World War II era to play. It's not the obvious strategy now for China, and it's not the strategy that most in the leadership would advocate. Rather, what China sees is a kind of inevitable slow shift towards a multipolar balance of power world. I've talked about this a couple other times on the podcast and elsewhere. And in that context, it is more, to go back to what we were talking about earlier, I care more about this than you do. Let's go slowly. ultimately it is about waiting for the US hegemony to sunset and watching it do so in sort of slow motion. And for most people analyzing this in China, at least those who are public about what they have to say, many people at least saw the 2008 economic crisis, September 11th first, 2008 after, as sort of the clear markers of this hegemonic decline, right? That the US has ever since been sort of the slowly sinking or slowly fading hegemon. And how fast or how slowly that decline will happen is debated. But the fact that the decline is in motion is kind of conventional wisdom in most policy and analyst circles in China. And so as the US declines, China can rise a bit. As the US retreats from East Asia, Southeast Asia, China will advance in those areas. And that has been happening, I think, arguably, certainly, in both East and Southeast Asia, and continues apace. And in fact, the pace maybe quickens the more that the US becomes isolationist or focused very heavily in other parts of the world. And so while it is true that some other countries will react to that by trying to assert their own sort of strategic autonomy or robust reaction, the only one that China really has to worry about as a rival great power is Japan. And there's sort of an assumption already in China that Japan is a competing great power. It's one of the 4 or 5 poles around which the multipolar world will organize itself. And then the question is basically, is Japan a greater threat or a smaller threat when it is more closely or less closely linked to the United States? And that's very much an open question. Were Japan to be fully autonomous of the United States, were that security alliance to break down, or the US to prove so unreliable that it's essentially a worthless partner, it's not obvious that Japan would be less threatening to China. Some would say it'd be more threatening. But there are arguments that it could be easier then to actually play this balance of power politics in a more comprehensive way. It's very hard to balance 3 other powers when 2 of them are in lockstep with one another. And so, Russia, Japan, and the US basically being the 3 other powers that China's most worried about balancing. And so that in that sense, the US retreat, the US decline, the US sort of fading of hegemony is only a good thing. But pushing too fast would only provoke stringent reactions from other players in the region, notably Japan, but also South Korea and across Southeast Asia, right? There are many states in Southeast Asia that are in a position fundamentally of being unable to delink from China economically. I remember, as I always say, ASEAN is China's largest trading partner by a good measure, and that relationship is growing. For most states in Southeast Asia, almost all actually, China is by a significant margin their largest trading partner and growing. They're not going anywhere. China's not going anywhere. Geographically, they sit next to each other. That economic relationship will remain key. Yet many states in Southeast Asia have serious misgivings in security terms about China's activity in the region and China's role in the region, as well as the American role in the region, and how those are sort of facing off against each other. So pushing too hard, squeezing too tightly to try to control Southeast Asia can only backfire, certainly in security terms. And we see that again and again in China's activities in the South China Sea, and indeed the domestic political and policy debates in China about how prudent it is to push harder or more gently in that part of the world. And I think ultimately what we'll see is a gentler, slower approach than many might be tempted to assume, given what can look like a wide open opportunity.
So they're going to win friends and influence people?
On some level, but on some level, it's really just waiting for one's adversary to leave the field before trying to advance. And so if you accept the premise that the United States is basically in, I don't want to say terminal decline, because I don't think it's assumed that the US will collapse or no longer be a major world player, but only that in the current context, no country, not even the United States, if it were to grow and invest more in its defense capabilities, is capable of being a global hegemon on its own. And even a coalition of, say, the United States and Japan is not going to really be able to assert hegemony the way that the US has asserted in the relatively recent past. So if you see this sort of relative decline of the hegemon, there is a space that will open up, at least regionally. And I should also note, China's not looking to win all friends and influence all people, or control the entire world. It does not aspire to be a global hegemon to replace the United States. What China is looking for is a regional hegemony, at least in really Southeast Asia and parts of Central Asia, with this accommodation or balance achieved in East Asia and to the north of the border in North Asia, you could say, although we seldom use that term. But basically some kind of balance with Japan and Russia, both bilaterally and between the two, and then more dominance sort of from Taiwan south. Whether China can do that, I don't know, but that's a much more modest proposal than saying, we want to replace the United States as global hegemon. And I fundamentally think China does not want to replace the United States as global hegemon. And I think a lot of people in the US incorrectly assume that. They think they're dealing with an adversary that wants to displace them, whereas actually they're dealing with an adversary that is looking to reach a balance of power arrangement with both as sort of co-equal poles within that. And it's a very different dynamic, therefore.
I'm bound to jump in here as someone looking at it from the vantage point of Japan. I mean, Bill, what you set out is very persuasive, but there are voices, as you know, in Japan who echo the views of China hawks in Washington. And increasingly, you might say, particularly amongst younger voters and younger politicians, Japan has moved much closer to align itself with like-minded individuals in Taiwan. It increasingly has been much more explicit in identifying the nature of the security threat that China represents, particularly in the East China Sea and in the Senkakus. We've seen a very substantive uptick in the amount of intrusions, both air and maritime based, by Chinese military vessels and aircraft. And that's creating a really profound sense of anxiety in Japan. And I wonder to what extent that in and of itself undermines this argument about trying to sort of balance, because it provides, of course, now very powerful arguments for more conservative-minded politicians in Japan to really push the envelope on defense expenditure, even if Japan's kind of fiscal constraints and the demographic challenges that Japan faces make it very difficult for Japan to rapidly expand its defense expenditure. I think it's really quite striking how the debate over defense in Japan has changed. And this comes back to Ali's point about true believers, right? I mean, we often look at states that are trying to make these calculations as if they're making them in a very rational context. There are true believers also in Japan, not just the usual suspects on the far right of the political spectrum, but ordinary voters. It's really striking, for example, how in the last metropolitan Tokyo elections, a small party called Sanseito, which was running on an anti-immigration platform, has started to gain real momentum. And with the LDP now languishing in the low 20s and the expectation that Ishiba might lose his majority in the upper house on July 20th, it's kind of an open question, really, whether Japanese politics could pretty radically change. Same is true even of Korea. Yes, we've just had a president elected with a pretty decisive majority, Lee Jae-myung, but still 1/5 of the Korean population is still solidly behind the conservative opposition, the former governing party, and populism and nationalism and competing notions of national identity have become much more prominent in internal debates in South Korea in a way that I think offers us a cautionary note about the ability of civil servants and politicians to kind of work in this sort of pragmatic, focused way. Again, to come back to public opinion, the extent to which anti-Chinese sentiment in South Korea has become much more powerful. So that creates an opportunity for the United States to try and exploit that in terms of strengthening its mini or multilateral security cooperation in addressing the question of China. So I think we might see quite a lot of change, particularly at the level of public opinion.
I would like to ask a question, because as you've all been talking, I've been trying to sort out in my head the relationship between some of these really nasty wars and conflicts which are going on in the world at the moment. And obviously, Russia and Ukraine is one, and Israel and Palestine and Iran is another. But there are lots of others on multiple continents. And in a lot of cases, China and America, and you can include America and all their allies to varying degrees, are on different sides. And Russia-Ukraine is a sort of really clear one. I think Iran is interestingly complicated because China's trying to everyone's hedging a bit. But in my head, I then thought, where is the chicken and where is the egg? Because is the state of tenseness between America and China actually the driving factor for all these conflicts, or at least for their continuance? Or is it the exacerbator? Do we then have the conflicts themselves are pulling China and America into positions of enmity because they're supplying weapons to one side or another, because state visits are happening publicly on TV. So then when you have President Xi meeting President Putin, that changes the dynamic in President Trump's mind. Where is the chicken and where is the egg on all of this? Or is it impossible? And that's the last question, because we're going to run out of time. But
yes, I can take that one probably pretty quickly. And I think the first thing to stress is that China's policy on all of these various conflicts has been fundamentally reactive rather than proactive, right? The conflicts have happened not because China wanted them, but for reasons completely extraneous to China's policies. And in all of these cases that we've been talking about, the conflict has threatened, at least, if not directly upset, a balance that China was seeking otherwise. So as we've talked about in previous episodes on the podcast, right, China does not want Russia to lose or to be further weakened or isolated on the world stage, precisely because it's one of those three poles that has to balance others. And particularly with Japan and the United States remaining quite close and both remaining quite powerful, Russia is the key balancer against those two. And so if Russia becomes even weaker, even more isolated, or were to collapse, that's catastrophic. If Ukraine ends up in NATO and NATO grows even bigger and US influence in Europe is so large that Russia really is no longer a European power, that also is potentially catastrophic from China's basic calculus. So for that reason, China is sort of forced into trying to do everything possible to make sure that Russia doesn't lose. But that said, China's relationship with Ukraine for the last 25, 30 years has also been very close and very important in economic terms, also in security terms. As I keep pointing out, that aircraft carrier that was repurposed and then eventually used as the redesign model or prototype for this new generation of aircraft carriers that China's hoping to build was in fact Ukrainian, right? They purchased it from Ukraine, not from some other random country. So when China says they want to be neutral in the conflict, that's not false. But they do have very strong incentives to kind of lean to one side, uncomfortable as that is, right? They're not happy about helping Russia or hurting Ukraine, or indeed the conflict continuing. I think the best outcome that China could hope for is some kind of a stalemate that does return something close to the status quo, either at the beginning of the war or what we see now, such that Russia is not unduly weakened, but Ukraine is also not shattered or pushed directly into the arms of NATO or the European Union. In regards to the Iran-Israel conflict, Iran is kind of the linchpin of China's Middle East and Central Asia policy in many ways. It's had a very comprehensive and deep relationship with Iran for a very long time. But as China recently has been fond of pointing out, China is one of the only powers outside the region that has really positive relations with Iran, with Israel, and with Saudi Arabia. There aren't too many that have really cordial relations with all three of those countries. And so now this is only another sort of minefield, so to speak, with Israel and Iran entering into a conflict. China really doesn't want to be in the position of having to support either side. But again, I think it's sort of a scenario in which the real catastrophe would be for Iran to lose badly or to collapse. And so whatever it takes to prevent that eventuality is what China is going to have to do as a top priority. And then as a secondary priority, try to manage things as best as possible to achieve what other outcome might be more positive. But I think China also recognizes that its leverage and degree of influence in the Middle East is far more limited even than it is with Russia and Ukraine, which again is more limited than it would be, for example, in Myanmar or other conflict zones much closer to home. So, there are real limits to what China can and cannot do. And I think there's also an aspect of leaders in China are wise to the fact that others will blame China for supporting or not supporting one side or the other side as quickly as they can, right? So there's a sense that they'll very quickly be scapegoated if they're seen publicly to be helping or not helping particular sides. And so it's quite difficult to navigate in terms of the war for public opinion globally, as well as the implications of what one actually does for the battlefield.
This is fascinating. I'm now looking at the clock. Does anyone else want to?
I just have one sort of wild card sort of idea to throw into this discussion, which is, in terms of how the sort of binary division is being framed, perhaps it's worth reminding ourselves the extent to which temperament matters and the authoritarian sensibilities of Donald Trump, his willingness to do deals with strongmen. We haven't said much about North Korea. I'm sure there's a lot we could say, but one thing that is concentrating minds in Seoul is the possibility that Donald Trump, propelled by his desire for a Nobel Peace Prize, on the basis of his past engagement with the DPRK, if he has the bandwidth, and that's a big if, given all the other conflicts that he's embroiled in, might be minded to sit down at some point. Whether Kim Jong-un is happy to do that at this stage, given the reinforcement that the new Russia-North Korea security partnership gives him, is another question. But for all of his much vaunted security strength, which we've seen developing steadily as a result of the new partnership, and the confidence that comes with that, economically the country's still weak, so they will need a deal. And Trump might just be minded to do that. And at that juncture, will he sell his traditional allies short? There's talk at the moment of 4,500 American troops potentially being rotated off the peninsula to Guam. That's purely talk. It's nothing substantive at this stage. And I think those questions, are indicative of just how much has changed in the way America does business with its traditional partners, which brings us back to that point that we started with, which is creative opportunities for like-minded countries, liberal democracies that still believe that those liberal democratic principles matter, might have to work together.
So I'm going to draw us to a close because we're out of time. John very nicely referenced back to Bill's point about hope springing eternal, and almost a little call to arms there of like-minded liberal democracies, that there is something we can do, but only if we believe it and get on with it. So in that spirit, I'm going to thank you very much for fascinating conversation, and I'm going to say goodbye from me.
And I'm going to say au revoir from me, because I hope to be invited back on occasion. But there it is, Suzanne. That's the end of our round. I was half expecting that, Bill and John might now have a series of our greatest hits that they'll be playing back. But I don't know how many greatest hits we've got. We probably don't have enough. It's been a good run, as I say, Suzanne, but we're very happy to be handing over to such great colleagues. And we will certainly, hopefully, be back on occasion.
Ali and Suzanne, I think we're going to be trawling through the back catalogue quite deliberately.
Please don't trawl through the back catalogue. Please. We probably say things that have
No,
turned out
don't,
definitely
John,
to have been wrong. So it's always better not to listen to the things you said were going to happen.
That's best, actually. I agree with that. I think this was a good trial run for OnGeopolitics. It's now going to go on to the really professional run. It's starting now. So there we are.
I think that's a spin that I'm sure we're going to disagree with. But anyway, it's nice to be following in your footsteps, both of you.
Indeed.
Okay, so goodbye and thank you for listening.
Au revoir.